So good morning. Okay. I'm Frank Verastro. I'm Senior Vice President and Director of the Energy and National Security Program at the Center. It's great to have you all here today. It's kind of cramped quarters. We have assembled a terrific panel. So part of what you heard this morning was the changing global landscape. And the same is true, I would argue, for the energy situation as well. Even as we sit here, there's monumental changes going on. In the last 5 years, we've seen Macondo, Fukushima more recently, the offshore spill set in place a new set of regulations. We've got new demand centers around the world, new global players, and at the same time, we have this potentially enormous new domestic resource. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today. So let me just start. I just want to frame a few arguments, and I'll introduce our panel. So the landscape that we talk about all the time, right? So about in the mid-2000s, early 2000s, we had a situation where the OECD countries, as demand growth centers, were overtaken by the non-OECD. And this is a dramatic change. It's causing headaches for both the EIA and for the IEA. I would argue as well, is because the data that we have on China, India is not that good. The Saudis have problems figuring out what Chinese demand is. I would argue that the Chinese have problems figuring out what Chinese demand is. We have emerging new players, and so there's new players, there's old players in new roles, but the landscape is shifting. And so the geopolitical footprint, as well as the emissions footprint and the energy footprint, is also shifting. The transformational impact of unconventionals, I would argue, you can't overstate this. It's potentially huge. Ed's going to talk about that a little bit more when we get towards the end. But the situation where, for the last 40 years, U.S. energy policy has been predicated on the dual notions of resource scarcity and growing demand. We may now be in a situation where we have, at least for oil, leveling or declining demand and an enormous resource base. But we have to figure out how to get it out correctly. So prudently, safer, cleaner, smarter. Environmental issues still loom large, and so we've been talking at CSIS about the great dilemma. How we incorporate both a low-carbon future with the current surge in unconventionals. Because if we have more oil and gas production, that extends the life of the fossil fuel system, which I would argue actually gives us breathing space to figure out what technologies we want to introduce to be able to get us into that transformational stage. You probably all know, you've seen enough about the Shale Gas Revolution, the difference between conventional and unconventional, especially as we look at continuous resources. This is source rock. For you that have dealt with geology. So instead of finding stratigraphic traps where the oil and gas is, we are now able to go to depths and with lateral wells, extended reach lateral wells, actually access the source rock that's generating the hydrocarbons. This is becoming an industrial process. Shale gas resources, again, enormous. When we started looking at this in 2007, which was a bit early even for us, we had the big three, then the top five, the Magnificent Seven, the top 10. We're up to 26 of these plays. And some of these plays are stacked. So when you look at the shales, there's the Marcellus at this layer, the Utica's below it, the Ordovician's below it, some areas the Mahogany's below that. The potential to stay in these zones and stay in these plays and produce for years and years and years, decades, is extraordinary. And since we are in Washington, if you look at this map, this is 200 electoral votes. U.S. shale production. So 5-6 years ago, it was less than 5% of domestic production. It's now a third. Oh, thank you. Okay. It's now a third. And the production has actually increased 60-fold over the last several years. It's offset declines. When we were talking 5-6 years ago about import dependence, the thought that U.S. demand and consumption would be met increasingly by pipeline imports from Canada and LNG. Now we're talking about the United States potentially being an LNG exporter. And the story for oil is equally impressive. So many of you in this room worked on the National Petroleum Council study. The NPC came out with an estimate for 22 million barrels of liquids in North America by 2035. That's an enormous pickup. So it's the Arctic, it's oil sands, it's offshore conventional, unconventional, deep water, the shale plays and the gas liquids. But this is turning out to be conservative. And you'll actually hear some more progressive estimates this morning. Tight oil opportunities in the United States, they span the lower 48, and they're actually changing the map of the United States. So our pipelines had been configured to actually bring oil to the Gulf of Mexico where our refining centers were. But now we're talking about building out from the center of the country and the infrastructure that's going to be required. This is going to be the big build over the next decade or two. It'll force a reconfiguration of refineries. You're going to talk about light sweet spreads with heavy sours. Your import-export balances will change, balance of payments, and the possibility for domestic refineries to have an enormous value add. Last year, we exported 3 million barrels a day of refined product. We still imported 8.5 of crude, but 3 million barrels a day of refined product. The tight oil production story, most of the story has been about the Bakken because it got the early start. But the Eagle Ford and the Niobrara, Wolfcamp, a number of other plays are coming in, and the big issue is whether or not we can take the experience in the Bakken and Eagle Ford and replicate it over and over and over again. And if you can, then the production increments are going to be several 100,000 barrels per day per year. And so when you start cumulatively adding these up to 2020, 2025, you get a remarkably different outlook for what the US can produce. And it can put us on par with Russia or Saudi Arabia. Now, we're still going to have growing demand in the world as well. And this is the infrastructure build-out. So there's bottlenecks in the infrastructure. And you always want to have your production timed for pipeline infrastructure. So if you're in the producing field, the last thing you want to do is have a pipeline ready and no production to deliver, or production ready but no place to put it. So you try to streamline those two, but permitting for pipelines sometimes takes quite a long time. And you have to put this idea in place, but you have to prove up the reserves first before you convince people to invest in the infrastructure. We're getting pretty far along in that plan. And then challenges and implications. And this came out both in the NPC study. It's now in the president's strategy about all of the above. It was in the CAB report on the natural gas finds that we have to manage this prudently. So there's economic, environmental, and energy considerations. We have to figure out how to do this sensitive, economically sound, and to do it in a time frame that actually makes sense. So we're going to continue along this thread this morning, and I got to tell you, the panel that we've assembled, I don't know any 4 better experts to have brought to this issue. It's a timely discussion. We have 4 outstanding speakers. Dan's actually going to come up first, and so our first speaker is the Honorable Dan Poneman. Dan serves currently as the Deputy Secretary of Energy, and it was about 3 years ago today when he was nominated by the President to serve in that post. He was confirmed in May of 2009. As Deputy Secretary, he has the distinction of serving as the department's COO. But in his spare time, he's also been the one that's responsible for a lot of the oil, gas, nuclear, global oil market initiatives. So I guess that keeps you fairly busy as we go forward. Over the past year, he really has become the focal point in dealing with SPR and global energy issues. And we're fortunate to have a person of his caliber in that role. His history with the department goes back to 1989. He started there as a White House fellow, little known fact. He served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director on the National Security Council under President Clinton. He was a principal with the Scowcroft Group, and he also served as a practicing attorney in Washington. In addition to Dan, so to Dan's right is Dave Lawrence. Dave is Executive Vice President for Exploration and Commercial for Shell Upstream Services. He's also been in his current position since 2009. Dave's a 28-year veteran of Shell, and he's held a variety of positions within the company, including Vice President for Corporate Strategy, Executive VP for Investor Relations, and Executive Vice President for Global Exploration. Prior to joining Shell, he was a college professor, and he also worked at USGS. And since Shell is one of the few companies with assets in offshore Alaska, Canada, the US onshore, both conventional and unconventional, as well as the Deepwater Gulf of Mexico, he brings a unique and informed perspective to this discussion this morning. Michael Bromwich, who is at the end, these guys changed seats on me this morning. Mike is currently head of the Bromwich Group and now a senior advisor at CSIS, which we're very grateful for. But he's probably best known, at least in the energy circles, for his exceptional work as director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Regulation, and Enforcement. That was BOEMR. At the U.S. Department of Interior, where all of you know he was responsible for the putting together the comprehensive regulatory and oversight function in the wake of the Macondo oil spill and got us back to work in the Gulf of Mexico. He too combines a career of both public and private sector service. He's been a litigation partner in both Washington and New York. He served as a U.S. attorney in New York and as Inspector General for the Department of Justice. And then closest to my right is Dr. Ed Morse. Ed's a longtime friend and colleague. He's currently Managing Director and Global Head of Commodities Research at Citicorp. He held similar positions at both Lehman Brothers, Lewis Capital, and then at Credit Suisse. He also claims considerable government service with the U.S. Department of State, where I first met him 30 years ago when we were just children, as well as serving as an advisor to the Departments of Energy, Defense, State, the IEA, and the UN. He's a former professor at Princeton, the publisher of Petroleum Intelligence Weekly, and he also worked at both Hess and Phillips. So we have an extraordinary group for you today, and please join me in welcoming our first speaker, the Honorable Dan Poneman. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank, for that overly generous introduction. And I would like to salute you for your energy leadership over the years, and I'm proud to call you not only one of my friends, but a professor from whom I continually learn. I also want to thank CSIS for putting together this distinguished panel and a distinguished set of circumstances. I'm only here because I can't go see Brent Scowcroft and Zabig Brzezinski in the other room at the moment. But it's not surprising to me to see that we have a good turnout here, because really today energy security tops our national concerns, and I think all of us here are keenly aware of that fact. Rising gasoline prices are a burden to every family, a burden to every business, and I think the President has been eloquent and insistent on describing the importance that we place on addressing the oil and gas supply issues that are facing the nation, and doing what we can to make sure that the prices are at a level that are consistent with continued American growth. He has also been clear that we do not see this as a silver bullet kind of a strategy, that he is committed to what we call an all-of-the-above strategy, in which we are seeking responsibly to develop every available American resource. That clearly begins with our prodigious, as you just heard from Frank, oil and gas resources, about which we will return a bit later. But it also means we are continuing to build in other areas. We have the first nuclear power plant to receive a license down in Vogtle in 3 decades. We are pivoting hard to expand our renewable energy resource production, and we are on track to our objective of doubling the power generation out of renewables by the end of the year. And it means that we have to continue in every one of these dimensions to bend our efforts to continue to succeed. We have achieved a number, I think, of important milestones. Our dependence on imported oil has been going down every single year in the last several years. In 2011, American oil production reached its highest level in nearly a decade, and natural gas production has reached an all-time high. In the last year alone, we have cut net imports of oil by over 10%. That's the equivalent of 1 million barrels of oil per day. And for the first time, I think in 13 years, imports now account for less than half of U.S. domestic oil consumption. One of the most interesting statistics that came out of EIA, I see Guy Caruso here, and I've become a real fan of the various STIOs and AEOs and other things from our wonderful Energy Information Administration. But the United States has just flipped from being a net importer to a net exporter of oil products for the first time since 1949. But today we're here really to focus on the unconventional. That's what the title tells me. And I want to talk a little bit about how unconventional oil and gas resources have become such a vital part of our overall energy production story. And I will first talk a little bit about the resource formerly known as shale oil. I love all of Dan Yergin's books, and the nomenclature change which he suggested, given the confusion between oil shale and shale oil, I think was useful. It took me 3 times reading through to get it myself. And so we'll just call this tight oil so it doesn't get confused with the precursor Kerogen, which I think still is out there somewhere to be developed, but they haven't, I think, found an economically viable way to do that. But you already heard it addressed, I think, very eloquently by Frank. The tight oil that we have is very rapidly being developed, especially in places like Eagle Ford in South Texas, where production grew by more than 200% just last year. The Bakken Formation in North Dakota and Montana has increased its output by tenfold over the last 5 years. We're looking at states like North Dakota, Montana, Colorado, where rising production is outpacing the capacity of pipelines to deliver the oil to the refineries. That's why we've all been talking about and focusing on the situation in Cushing, where more oil is flowing in than we have pipelines to carry it back out again. The backlog is a problem, obviously. The President's very focused on this. It has dampened incentives for new production while restricting the ability of that oil to reach the state-of-the-art refineries we have down on the Gulf Coast. That's why last month the President laid out guidelines to expedite the review of pipelines from Cushing to expand and modernize other domestic pipeline projects to create jobs, promote more domestic production, and ultimately benefit consumers. The Seaway Reversal Project, which I'm sure many of you are here monitoring, is well on the way. It looks like we're going to have an additional 150,000 barrels per day of capacity by the second quarter of this year. We are hoping that the pump station additions and modifications that are expected to be complete by early next year will increase the capacity of the Seaway Pipeline Reversal by up to 400,000 barrels per day. These new oil supplies are adding both needed jobs and significant oil production to improve energy security and mitigate our trade balance. So that's the tight oil story. Turning to natural gas, I remember Frank was talking about 2007. They had a summer discussion about global politics of energy in Aspen, Colorado, and people were just beginning to talk about it, and frankly, some of them were looked a bit as cranks at that time. I think no one could imagine the incredible change that we've seen in our own production. Today, our shale gas production is over 30% of our total natural gas energy economy, of something on the order of 22 trillion cubic feet a year. Domestic gas production grew by an estimated 7.9% in 2011, which is the largest year-on-year increase that we have ever seen. It's really an incredible story. I had the opportunity just a few weeks ago to visit the Fayetteville shale plant. I hope many of you have an opportunity to get out to see the incredible job that they do, and the description Frank just gave about how they're accessing the gas out of the source rock is incredible, because they have calibrated the spacing between the little holes through which they do the fracking to such a degree that they're able horizontally to go through this rock so that the cracks propagate so that one horizontal line will just about match up with the other, and so the ability to get all that gas out of very tight, low permeability formations, it's really incredible. One of the things that we are proud of at the Department of Energy, where sometimes it is asked, what is the appropriate role of federal government in developing energy resources, at a time when there still was very limited interest in these sorts of gas development technologies and industry. Back in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Department of Energy invested on the order of $137 million in horizontal drilling techniques and in hydraulic fracturing. And they handed the ball off to the Gas Research Institute a few years later, and that small seed of investment has now produced this very prodigious energy resource, which we are all benefiting from, and the implications of this have been extraordinary, not only in energy terms, but in overall macroeconomic terms. Some experts estimate that the natural gas industry alone can support more than 600,000 American jobs in this decades. And it is obviously saving American families and businesses money when it comes to electricity prices and home heating, or for industrial processes and chemical feedstocks. The natural gas revolution, I think Dan Yergin may have been the first one to coin that term, has the opportunity to transform our transportation industry. We're exploring, in many ways, the use of natural gas as a substitute for gasoline and diesel in trucks and other vehicles. For example, we have always been looking at CNG as an option for our fleets of buses and delivery vehicles to save money, and finding ways in which we can accelerate the payback period on that investment. And through the President's Clean Fleets Initiative, the Department of Energy is now working with 18 commercial partners to understand and address the fueling infrastructure challenges that present the chief barrier to expanding this promising market. One of the challenges here, of course, when it deals with CNG is the tanks which contain them. They need to be lighter. They need to be able to be either low pressure or use better sorbent materials. We have them now on the order of 3,600 PSI requirements. If we get the pressures down to like 500 PSI, then you've got the opportunity not only to think about CNG for fleet vehicles, but actually to get them down to viability to be used in lightweight passenger vehicles. That would open another 60–70% of the market to a CNG opportunity, which could really have a very beneficial effect on fuel switching out of gasoline into natural gas. When I was out there at Fayetteville, I went to a CNG filling station, and the gas per gallon equivalent price was $1.50. So people, I think, would be very interested, and with the kind of price differential that's opened up between petroleum products and natural gas, I think there are going to be tremendous opportunities for continued fuel switching. Also on the liquefied natural gas side of the house, these efforts that we're undertaking have, I think, real opportunities for long-haul heavy trucks. We have looked at how we could get the infrastructure for fueling stations along the main corridors, and I think that as we make all of these shifts, it's not only something that's going to have economic benefit, but because of the lower greenhouse gas emissions of natural gas, it's going to help build our transition to a low-carbon future. Obviously, these developments have profound national security implications. On the security side, unconventional oil and gas production can help meet consumer demand and stabilize our supply. The demographic and geographic, I should say, dispersion of these resources is itself a source of energy security and hence a damper on market volatility. Our global trade position has also improved because of natural gas. Increased domestic production has displaced imports, and as a result, large volumes of natural gas that otherwise may have come to the United States, as Frank referred to in his opening remarks, are instead flowing into European markets. The burgeoning supply and lower cost of U.S. natural gas has also opened up the discussion of the possibility of exporting natural gas to worldwide markets. We recognize that natural gas exports are a potential generator of jobs and economic growth. To that end, the department has commissioned a two-part study, part of which is already complete, to take a look at the overall effect, all factors being considered, of what LNG exports would mean in terms of American jobs, trade balance, but also the effect on consumers here in the United States. And we're going to, I think, be very thorough in making sure we get those questions properly analyzed. Let me just say a little bit about the international implications. As Frank said, we've been working a lot on that in the last year or so. In a first effort to get our arms around the geographic and potential geopolitical impact that global shale gas production may have, the department's EIA has published a study last April of 48 shale gas basins in about 32 countries. Now, it's important to note this study did not purport to be definitive, but it's really a first assessment, a first look. That said, it shows tremendous resources available around the world in places as far-flung as China, South Africa, and Argentina, for example. And with a new horizon that has been unveiled by hydraulic fracturing technologies, the recoverable natural gas resources are now distributed so widely they're going to have major national security implications for countries that have been looking to diversify their energy supply and find themselves less dependent on external suppliers in a way that has sometimes led to unhappiness and tension in geopolitical hotspots. So even nations that don't have shale gas resources can benefit by having more suppliers to choose from. The results in terms of competitive pricing and diversified supply could bring both economic and security benefits. The cost of developing natural gas could be much higher if the resource is located remotely from the market, because transportation to markets still occurs by pipeline or through LNG liquefaction, shipping, and regasification. And it'll be interesting to see over time if the transportation component of natural gas pricing is able to be brought down. Of course, when it comes to oil, it's a very light burden, and that's why oil has really become a global market and is so fungible. But with spreads at the level that they now have reached, where We're now hovering around $2 per MBTU in the United States, $9 in Europe, and $15 to $17 in Japan. That not only opens up huge opportunities for fuel switching, but I think provides substantial incentives to do things that might drive down transport costs, and over time we may see some greater convergence of prices in global natural gas markets. It's important as we go through this really quite extraordinary story, and I would also commend, for those who haven't looked at it, people to look at the National Petroleum Council study, because I think it goes through many of these issues very well. But we also can't get ahead of ourselves. It's incredibly important. In fact, it's indispensable that as we develop, both on the oil side and the gas side, these prodigious resources, that we do so responsibly. And we have to preserve public confidence that the exploitation and development of these resources is being done safely and with full transparency to the public about the issues about which they have every right to know. I think probably everybody here knows that there are already moratoria in some parts of the world against the development of shale gas resources, precisely because there are places where public confidence has, before they've even gotten into the game in some cases, been undermined. So it's very, very important for government and industry to work together to inform their citizens about the science and about the regulations that can be put in place to ensure best practices. Additionally, as industry and host governments work together to develop shale gas resources, it is vitally important to be transparent in order to establish and then to preserve public confidence. Under President Obama's leadership, we are taking appropriate steps to ensure the safe and responsible harnessing of shale gas. To start with, the President directed Secretary Chu to establish a subcommittee of the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board to make recommendations to improve the safety and environmental performance of natural gas hydraulic fracturing from shale formations. The Shale Gas Subcommittee issued 2 reports within 6 months of beginning their work. They made 20 unanimous recommendations, many of which the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Department of Interior are looking to implement. We have also called upon industry to be more transparent about the use of chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing, and in addition, the Department of Interior is developing new standards to ensure public disclosure of chemicals used in that process on public lands, while the EPA is taking steps to address concerns about potential impacts to water and air resources. Stewarding our resources in the most responsible and prudent manner is the best way forward to advance our economy, to ensure our security, and to continue the clean energy revolution here in the United States. The opportunity and the challenge is clear. We must develop all of our resources safely and responsibly to preserve public confidence and to protect our environment. So, in conclusion, developing these incredible unconventional oil and gas resources presents a once-in-a-lifetime, perhaps once ever, opportunity for our country's prosperity and security. Throughout our recent history, reducing dependence on imported oil has been and will continue to be a top priority. After the 1973 oil crisis, President Gerald Ford said, "We have become increasingly at the mercy of others for the fuel on which our entire economy runs." Presidents before and after have continually sought to change that reality. Today, as we assess our progress, we must also forge ahead to finally make that vision that has been the goal of American presidents and the people of this nation for many generations a reality. And with the kind of expertise assembled here in this room and the efforts of people here and beyond, I think we have that opportunity. Thank you.
So Dan gave us some openings here. We talked about the resource potential and the role for government and business partnerships. We actually asked Dave and teed him up for some of this to talk about operating practices in the field. When we talk about best practices, we talk about resource assessment. What's the economic and the business model to actually get this done? So at this point, Dave, if you join us. Thanks.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here to share with this panel. I share the enthusiasm for the opportunities that we have with this new resource space. Frank, thanks for pulling this together in CSIS. It's a real privilege for me to speak about energy and energy security to a global security forum. It's energy security, I think, is of course one of the most important components of all security, whether it's global, hemispheric, or national. And here in the United States and North America, our energy security, I think it's fair to say, is the strongest it's been in quite a while. And we can see substantial opportunities for improvement. There are a number of factors in the supply and security turnaround, and nearly all of these are underpinned by advanced technology and expertise of people and resources of one form or another. But I think we all agree that it started and it's underpinned and it rests on this foundation that we built by this great production of natural gas and now light tight oil or liquid rich shale that we're seeing at this point in time. It's truly remarkable. The great majority of the world's oil and natural gas currently comes from fields that consist of pretty porous rock. The oil and natural gas flows through relatively easily. However, in recent years, new technology has been developed, and with innovation, we've now discovered and now brought on production major new volumes of tight oil and shale gas to the North American supply. The ability to harness the energy from shale and from tight gas is the most significant energy development in decades. And it's one we at Shell believe we can use to secure abundant, long-term energy for the future and for the good. Now, by now, I think most of us appreciate the scope of the global energy challenge, and we've lurched forwards towards a period of significant uncertainty in balancing energy supply and demand between now and 2050. Underlying global demand for energy is likely to double or even triple in the first half of this century. And as you've all heard by now, natural gas likely will play a far more significant role in meeting this challenge than we previously assumed. In fact, this year, for the first time, Shell expects to produce more gas than oil. So more natural gas than oil this year. But while the potential of the natural gas boom is dramatic, there's much more to this story. Liquid-rich shale, there are lots of terms, now also known as tight oil, will capture the lion's share of the industry investment in North America this year and next. These are shale deposits that are rich with either light crude or the natural gas liquids, and that's important, that are coveted by manufacturers and chemical producers, principally ethane, propane, butane, and pentanes. Growth in this sector is likely to prove transformative to the United States. Secondly, the potentially huge oil resources in Alaska's offshore, where Shell is increasingly hopeful of finally exploring in 2 areas this summer, could restore that region's importance to U.S. energy security. Heavy oil and production from the Canadian oil sands will continue to be crucial to North America. And increased oil and gas production from our heartlands, from deep waters and new formations in the Gulf of Mexico, will continue to make significant contributions to supply. Finally, we shouldn't forget that the innovation of industry, academia, and government will continue to develop new plays, new ideas, new reservoirs, and to build on what I've just stated. Now remember, 30 years ago, there was no Deepwater. And 15 years ago, there wasn't much of a natural gas, hydrofrac, tight gas industry. And 5 years ago, there wasn't much of a liquid-rich shale. So you can imagine, you need to have that vision for what could come. Before I return to the shale energy revolution, let me comment on some traditional basins that represent high-impact opportunities for enhanced U.S. energy security. First, the potential resource base of Alaska can and should play a major and growing role in energy supply to the U.S. market. If we don't move forward with the Alaska OCS development this summer and exploration, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System will continue on its decline, constricting one of the key energy arteries in the U.S. Secondly, the Canadian oil sands are a vast resource, and they reside in the neighborhood. Growth there could enhance our own energy security via pipeline versus other foreign imports. And I won't speak in depth, it's already been touched on the need for adequate North American infrastructure, but I think it's obviously an imperative for domestic energy security. Third, notwithstanding the production setbacks that resulted from the Deepwater Horizon disaster, the Gulf of Mexico continues to be an incubator of technological innovation and a key producing basin for the United States, a trend that we see continuing into the foreseeable future. We've invested billions in Alaska, in the Gulf of Mexico, and oil sands, even through volatile market conditions, because we continue to believe that the size of that prize is worth it. Taken together, these developments, deepwater production, Alaska, and oil sands, promise to improve the outlook for energy security here and elsewhere around the world. But the real revolution also is occurring right here onshore, and that's in the development of shale gas, tight gas, and liquid-rich shales. Now, Dan Yergin and others have called it the shale gale, and that's putting real wind in the sails of U.S. energy, economy, and fundamentally altering our energy security. The underlying change is technological. Instead of targeting simple traps, and sometimes they're not so simple, I can tell you, from traps of oil and gas, we can now pull hydrocarbons from vast, thin seams locked within impermeable, what used to be called source rocks, and still are, but now they're also reservoir rocks, making the energy process much more akin to a manufacturing process, though the sweet spots still need to be identified through exploration. Let's look at natural gas. At Shell, we're active in tight gas and shale gas assets across North America, from Canada into the US and into South America. In North America, Ground Birch and Deep Basin in Canada, Pinedale in Wyoming, Haynesville in Louisiana, Eagleford in Texas, and Marcellus in Pennsylvania. And building on our experience, because these plays, geology does not know political boundaries. Building on our experience in North America, we are creating shale gas positions in places like China, in Germany, in eastern Ukraine, and South Africa, and in Latin America in places like Brazil. The additions of these resources to the world's energy bank is already changing global energy dynamics. The growth of the U.S. natural gas supply is having a ripple effect and is contributing significantly to the economic recovery. As the President noted in his State of the Union address, natural gas activities alone, as already cited, could add more than 600,000 U.S. jobs by the end of this decade. Now, let me give you some examples. For example, in western Pennsylvania, Shell recently announced selection of a potential site for what would be a world-class facility that will manufacture base chemicals from gas feedstock in the Marcellus Shale region. This is the first of its kind in decades. 7 other companies have indicated that they're interested in building similar new capacity in the U.S. We're also working hard to find other ways to expand the economic abundance and benefits of this abundant resource by investing in the natural gas value chain. Liquefied natural gas for transportation is a great example. LNG holds tremendous promise as a cleaner transport fuel. As an alternative to diesel, it's a smart way to reduce emissions of sulfur oxides and particulates. In Western Canada, Shell is preparing to make LNG available this year to fleet operators along the busy truck route from Calgary to Edmonton. We'll install a small-scale gas liquefaction plant in Alberta, and we'll dispense LNG at Shell and Flying J truck stops throughout Western Canada. We'll draw on the region's natural gas to produce this LNG. We believe fleets on this route could see a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of up to 20% wells to wheels. Shell is considering bringing LNG transport corridors to other producing regions with ample supplies, and we welcome this development. And we're also looking at ways to use LNG as a transport fuel in the rail business, in mining and marine sectors, as well as in oil and gas drilling. There are many uses that we can see. Of course, natural gas can provide a cleaner source of electricity than coal for the world's growing fleet of electric vehicles. Another example of the expanding value chain that we're actively exploring is a gas-to-liquids technology, which transforms natural gas into higher-valued liquids and chemicals. Shell is a pioneer and leader in gas-to-liquids technology with a track record of research and production going back 4 decades. Last year in Qatar, we opened Pearl, the world's largest gas-to-liquids plant. We think gas-to-liquids technology could make a lot of sense in North America, a lot of sense. It would further reduce the need for imported oil and create new jobs and greater value from our abundant natural gas. With an abundance of natural gas supply, the U.S. is a natural market to investigate how to best bring GTL to consumers. Thus, we're assessing the feasibility of natural gas-based fuels for the U.S. market. Now, more recently, the Shale Revolution has begun to change the future potential for oil production in the U.S. The application of horizontal drilling and multi-stage hydraulic fracturing to oil-bearing source rock in locations like the Bakken and the Three Forks in North Dakota and Montana has made a significant contribution, as already described, in U.S. oil production. And like shale gas, success has led to the identification and development of similar opportunities in other areas. Again, the geology doesn't know the political boundaries. I should mention, for example, the Niobrara Shale in Colorado, portions of the Eagle Ford in Texas, the Utica Shale in Ohio, the Mississippi Lime Shale in Kansas, the Wolfcamp, the Monterey in California, and many other plays in places like Canada. Shell has taken positions in several of these plays and others. Early results look promising. We're also pursuing shale oil globally on prospects in countries such as Colombia, in Argentina, in Germany, and Turkey. Current estimates of U.S. tight oil production potentially over the next 15 to 20 years have been rising steadily as the nature of the resource becomes better understood through exploration. Ed will talk more about this. And experts now tally shale oil resources in the lower 48 at more than 24 billion barrels and expect production to reach the 2.5 to 3 million barrels per day range, or as you might hear, even higher. For comparison, the Prudhoe Bay field in Alaska, the country's largest, produced a maximum of 1 million barrels a day at its peak. So potentially, this could make truly a significant impact on U.S. oil production and overall security. As great as an increase that will be, it won't deliver by itself energy dependence. We'll still need a lot of gas and a lot of other sources we can talk about. But we should never forget, every barrel produced here means more than $100 stays in this country and circulates through our economy, creating jobs, buying goods, and paying taxes, rather than being sent away, sometimes to places that it's rather difficult to work in. Bringing new energy to market at scale is a long-term process. It involves tremendous capital, and today's shale success in gas and tight oil and the enormous efforts that we're making in Alaska is the fruition, and it's important of many years of evaluation, of technology, of investment, and of patience, I think. It requires sustained work on a required geology, on the drilling techniques, technology, and development practices. The scope for continuing this success in the new areas of shale energy and frontier resources is tremendous. There are a lot of positives around onshore gas and oil development, but as you know, we also face persistent public skepticism about the safety and environmental impact of finding and developing these resources. We need to do a better job of listening and responding. The fact is, hydraulic fracturing has been performed more than 1 million times in the United States alone over the past 60 years. Documented instances of freshwater contamination are extremely rare. When properly designed and when problems have occurred, they are simply due to poorly designed wells. When a well is designed and constructed properly, groundwater will not be contaminated. So as an industry, and this is important, we should insist and benefit from strong regulation and enforcement to assure everyone in the industry does the job right. We don't benefit when somebody screws up. It needs to be done right. To summarize, the scale of energy production, whether offshore Alaska, the Gulf of Mexico, or onshore North America, and its long-term importance to nearly every corner of our economy, makes it vital that the public discussions and policy making be based on hard facts and rigorous analysis. There are environmental and operational challenges associated with the production of tight and shale gas, tight oil, and other resources. But our industry has the expertise to effectively deal with these challenges, especially if we are governed by rational, well-targeted, and robustly enforced regulations. Finally, we need to earn the confidence of communities and the public that the industry as a whole has a relentless focus on improving environmental performance. And we need to cooperate with government and non-governmental organizations that have a stake in developing these resources the right way. Now at Shell, we take that responsibility of safely and responsibly developing resources seriously, and we try to take an active seat at the table. Along with this intense focus on current operations, we're focused on the long-term view, because what we do now needs to push the envelope of technology and innovation. If we have a chance of sustaining the energy needs our rapidly growing world will need, it'll take just about everything we have. It'll take identification of the resources, it'll take our best people, it'll take our best technology, it'll take our best innovation, and it'll take a real understanding of what we need to be able to do this safely and in a way that's clean and does not harm the environment. We're committed to working in that area, and we think it's a tremendous potential for the country and for the world. Thank you.
So I love it when a plan comes together. So Dave talked about responsible, well thought, and strong regulation. And the personification of that is actually the next speaker, Mike Bromwich. Mike was kind of brought in as a fixer. He held a number of jobs in the US government. His familiarity with offshore oil and gas, not high, steep learning curve when he first came in, but he listened. And he thought through what needed to be done, what was responsible and reasonable to do in a short time frame, with the notion that we had to get back to work in the Gulf of Mexico, and then put together comprehensive oversight, best practice, worked collaboratively with industry. This is Mike's first time appearing in public as a CSIS senior advisor, so we're extremely fortunate to have him in that regard. But Mike, if you could join us, this would be terrific. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Frank. It's a pleasure to be here with you and all of you today, and to make my debut with my CSIS affiliation. It really is a pleasure, and it's an honor to be on a panel with such distinguished participants in the energy sector. As Frank alluded to, my knowledge of the energy area was not thick when I was asked to do this job, but I learned a lot, and I learned quickly. One of the things I did while I was head of BOMER was I gave 3 quite long speeches at CSIS. I'm going to change up a little bit from that and be, I hope, quite brief and just focus on a couple of specific issues. 1, the background of the offshore drilling reform that we engaged in. 2, the substantive regulatory reforms we put in place. 3rd, the important and I think enduring organizational reforms that we put in place. And finally, Frank asked me to talk a little bit about the enduring lessons from Deepwater Horizon, not those that stem from the immediate causes of the blowout, but longer-term lessons that perhaps we can draw from it. So as you know, we're now approaching the 2-year anniversary of Deepwater Horizon. It's about 10 days away, and I don't need to remind you of the tragedy that was. 11 people dead, many injured, 4.9 million barrels of oil spilled into the Gulf of Mexico, with those horrific scenes of the CNN video feed showing the oil going into the Gulf for day after day, week after week. That event triggered intense scrutiny of the regulatory agency, the Foreign Minerals Management Service, that had been responsible for regulating offshore drilling. And as Frank alluded to, over many months, we carefully looked at and then reviewed and overhauled the agency structure and put in place significant new regulations designed to deal with offshore exploration and development. So let me just repeat and mention the substantive regulatory reforms we put in place. We put in a new comprehensive drilling safety rule that dealt with the technical aspects of deepwater drilling, casing, cementing, requiring for the first time the certification of drilling programs by professional engineers, and a regime for testing blowout preventers that had not been required before. Second, we put in place at about the same time, late September, early October of 2010, a new comprehensive rule that requires companies and operators to comprehensively analyze the risks and hazards of operations, the so-called Semmes Rule, which is, for the first time, bringing into the U.S. regulatory environment a performance-based as opposed to a prescriptive system of regulation. That has been in effect for about a year. Enforcement didn't begin until November of 2011. A number of companies needed time to put in place systems which for them were new. And so enforcement and the interest in enforcement didn't begin until a year later. We told the industry in advance that we were going to give them a year grace to try to incorporate the new requirements that they were required to abide by. There has more recently been a second generation of Semmes Rule that's been proposed that would require, among other things, mandatory audits of the Semmes programs. So those were the immediate substantive regulatory reforms. There are more to come. Let me talk briefly about the organizational reforms that we did. It had been noticed before, and it was focused on intently, that the structure of the MMS was intrinsically a set of conflicts and competitions among different missions. The agency was responsible for royalty and revenue collection. It was responsible for trying to ensure the balanced development of offshore resources, and it was also responsible for regulation and enforcement offshore. Some of those missions didn't get done in the way they should have, namely the regulation and enforcement mission, because so much emphasis was placed primarily on royalty and revenue collection. So what we did after long review and careful review and a sifting through of the options was to create a structure that provides an ability for separate agencies to focus on newly focused missions. So now with a separate revenue and royalty collection office, it no longer drives resource management decisions because they are in separate agencies. And by the same token, resource management decisions no longer drive regulatory and enforcement decisions because they too are in separate agencies. So now for the first time in the agency's 29-year history, you have multiple agencies and you have a single agency, BSEE, that has the regulatory and enforcement capabilities that can be appropriately developed rather than starved, which was their history. But one of the key problems that the agency had over time was its inability to garner the necessary funding support to do its various jobs. That has now been significantly addressed in a major way, and Congress did provide supplemental budgetary funds in 2010 for fiscal year 2011, and additional funding in 2011 for fiscal year 2012. This is a milestone in the history of offshore drilling regulation because for the first time, the agencies do begin to have adequate resources to do their very important jobs. So that's a brief thumbnail of what we saw when we got on board in June of 2010 and the specific substantive and organizational reforms we put in place over the 18 months that followed. But let me talk very briefly about 7 lessons that I think we've learned from Deepwater Horizon that are applicable both to Deepwater and to the other frontier area that Dave alluded to, namely the Arctic. First, investments in safety and environmental protection must keep pace with advancing technology and continued ambition to move into the frontier areas. That clearly did not happen in government, and it did not happen sufficiently in industry. And the investments I'm talking about really are in 3 separate but related areas. One is in prevention, second is in containment, and the third is in spill response. Second, industry needs to focus on creative ways to share innovations in safety and environmental protection, both with each other and with the government. They shouldn't be stovepiped. They shouldn't be kept completely private. There needs to be a more robust sharing of that kind of knowledge than there has been in the past. Third, there needs to be a stepped-up research program on the specific challenges that are posed by frontier environments, both the Arctic, the Deepwater, and where we'll soon be going, the ultra-deepwater. And the research needs to be done both by industry and by the government. Fourth, creative steps need to be taken to bolster the technical expertise of government through exchange programs with other countries and with exchange programs with industry, some sort of secondment program, so that government can get the benefit of industry expertise that exists. Fifth, there needs to be renewed and continuing focus on the recruitment of engineers with adequate levels of expertise. They must be brought into government, and that must remain a high priority. That has been a problem historically. It remains a problem. Sixth, even in an era of government austerity, which we're in now, focus needs to be given on ensuring adequate funding for the regulatory agencies. My concern is that the funding now is better than it's ever been, but as memories fade, as the second-year anniversary turns into the third and the fifth, that the immediacy of the problem will recede and that people will forget how important it is that the regulatory agencies, as Dave suggested, need to be strong and robust, and that is in the long-term best interests of everyone, the industry and the public. And seventh and finally, there is a need for greater global cooperation on prevention, on containment, and on spill response. One of the things that was brought home to me in the 18 months I spent at the Department of the Interior, this is truly a global enterprise. This is not a Gulf of Mexico issue, it's not an Arctic issue, it's a worldwide issue. There are more and more countries that are getting into the offshore game, and in particular into the Deepwater game. And we need to help those countries. We need to work with the countries that have experience in Deepwater, and this really needs to be much more of a coordinated international global effort to try to enhance safety and environmental protection than it has been historically. So those are my brief remarks. Look forward to any questions you may have after we're done, and it's a pleasure being here today.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. Ed Morse, and it gives me extreme pleasure to have Ed with us, in part because we don't see enough of him down in Washington now that he's up in New York on a full-time basis, but he's always provocative and entertaining, and he's bringing me along slowly on how aggressive and optimistic we ought to be on the resource potential here, because it has huge global implications. So join me in welcoming Ed Morse.
Thank you, Frank, and thanks for convincing me to come. It's always great to be here. I'm not often introduced as entertainment, but I'm happy to assume that role to the degree I can. And I'd really like to start my remarks based on Mike's latest set of comments, because I think one of the most enduring contributions that the government has made in the regulatory environment is just this reform of the Deepwater that we've just heard a good deal about. And I wanted to put this in perspective in two different ways. First, to note that before the Macondo disaster, the U.S. had a third world nation regulatory regime for the Deepwater, not just because of the conflicts of interests that were discussed when you had the same agency dealing with acreage letting, with revenue generation and collection, and with safety, but because, as a wonderful Reed report issued in September 2008 from the Inspector General of the Department of Interior noted, that this was all about sex, gambling, drugs, and illicit relations between government officials and the industry. It's sort of a wonderful read. And it's an indication, A, that this shouldn't have happened, but B, that what's happening now has global ramifications, and the global ramification that's most critical is really simple to think about. What's simple to think about is that between 1984 and the very recent years, 2009, the world was consuming more oil than it was discovering year in, year out, following 140 years in which the world was discovering more oil than it was consuming. And part of this was because of low prices. Part of this was because colleagues like mine in equity research were punishing companies that were diverting resources to capital expenditure programs and away from share buybacks and dividend returns to investors. But it took a while to deal with a period of time of underinvestment. And the real turning point started not in shale gas or in tight oil sands or even the oil sands of Canada, but rather the turning point was in the Deepwater. And as Dave mentioned, if you go to 1990, there was no exploration in Deepwater. In fact, in 1990, there was only one vessel capable of doing exploration in deep water worldwide. And even by 2000, a decade later, there were only 17 vessels capable of doing that kind of exploration. And now there are about 250. And the pace of growth is sort of like 7.5% per year. And that is resulting in a kind of doubling of the potential of deep water every decade. So we moved from nothing to 5 million barrels a day in the last decade. This decade is moving from 5 million barrels a day to 10, even with the disaster of the Macondo, and even with the delay in drillings that were associated with this massive reform in the United States. And then by the next decade, it should go from 10 to 20 million. And the U.S. was a leader in this. It still is a leader in it. The U.S. had at the Macondo timing about a third of the global market for deep water. It should have had a third of the global market today, and maybe with the reform, it will. Now, 7.5% change, cumulative change in a production of anything, has really extraordinary snowballing consequences. And what I'd really like to talk about is the snowballing consequences of what seems to be unfolding in the world. It's always instructive to come to Washington. You listen to people talk about regulation. I come from a city in which nobody talks about regulation except to the extent to which the imposition of government can more likely impede rather than assist in markets. So it's always intriguing to me to hear comments like the ones we've heard today with notes about responsibility and doing things the right way. But I want to kind of share some reflections with you because what's happening today kind of reminds me of the world in 1990, the world that's being discussed in the other room. It's a world in which the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War was over. And there are a whole bunch of people around the world who refused to believe that the Cold War was over and kept fighting other battles. If we look back, we're going to fight the old war. If we're looking forward, what we're seeing unfolding is something more dramatic, I think, than the comments that we've heard around the table. Because whether we look at it in terms not of oil independence, I think it is oil independence, but if we don't look at it in terms of oil independence, but think of it in other terms like the ability to reindustrialize the United States, in terms of the real fundamental issues of energy security and the real opportunities for citizens, we can come up with a whole different set of reflections. And I want to start. This one slide tells you about a 92-page report that my colleagues and I at Citi published a couple of weeks ago on this general subject. And we talked about North America as the new Middle East for one good reason, and that is liquids production and gas production, hydrocarbons production in North America are growing faster than in any other part of the world. This was the case in the 5 years prior to last year, and it was the case last year, although the difference last year was rounded. Canada and the U.S. added 1 million barrels a day to global liquids production, and in the previous 5 years added 1 million barrels a day. This is an accelerating phenomenon. The table on the left side has a lot of numbers in it. It includes biofuels and other kinds of liquids in terms of what consumers have, and it's just U.S. and Canadian production. It doesn't include production from Colombia or Venezuela or Mexico. And what looks inevitable from this is kind of self-sufficiency. And you might say, well, this is kind of impossible. We actually excluded any development from the Monterey in California. And yes, we look at it as what might be possible. But it's based on extrapolations of trends that have understated the growth of hydrocarbon production in North America. The line at the top is a line that describes a decline in product consumption in the United States. We have North America, or U.S. and Canada, on the histograms, and on the line we have U.S. product demand. And I want to comment on that 1 million barrel a day decline that we project for this decade, because that's a really low number, and in all likelihood the number is going to be double that And I want to reflect on two of the critical elements that go into that, looking at gasoline demand and at diesel demand, starting with diesel demand, and starting with Dave's comments about what his firm is doing with respect to LNG and CNG, and Secretary Poneman's observations on what is being done through private-public partnership. And I want to contrast that with what's actually being done in the marketplace. If we just look at plans for distribution of CNG and LNG, not in Canada, but in the lower 48 states, inevitably from those distribution plans, between now and 2015, there will be a 200,000 barrel a day savings on diesel demand. And that includes the tight correlation between diesel demand on the one hand and GDP growth on the other hand. For every 1% increase in GDP in the US, we've got a 30 or 40-year history of a 0.8% increase in diesel demand. So this decline in diesel demand is coming about even as the GDP is growing. And it comes about because of the substitution impact of the allocation of distribution centers along highway systems, forgetting about what's happening in urban environments. And to put numbers on it, we have something like 30 CNG distribution centers in various parts of the country where it matters. There'll be an additional 60 this year. China already has 160 of them, by the way. And the ones in China are not there as a result of government policy. They're there as a result of the same fundamental economic factors that are driving this astonishing growth in the United States, which would bring the decline in diesel to close to 500,000 barrels a day by the end of the decade, all other things being equal. And that is this extraordinary discrepancy in price between the delivered price of CNG and the price of an equivalent amount of diesel. And if you want to look at it molecule for molecule, it's an 18-to-1 relationship in the United States, and it takes $7,000 to add the necessary requirements to a truck. You don't even need to replace a truck. And that investment is returned in a year. So obviously, there's a market that is accelerating with very cheap gas, and the gas will be very cheap even if it's doubled in price, as I expect it will be by 2015, given the expected differentials that will likely exist between diesel and natural gas. On the gasoline side, we're only using government fuel efficiency standards, only looking at the increase in CAFE standards impacting on the vehicle fleet. I have a lot of charts in this presentation, which is available if you want, looking at what's happening to gasoline demand in the US. There's some significant demographic drivers at work. Some of them are temporary, some of them are permanent. As I know fully well, you get to a certain age and the number of vehicles you tend to have is fewer than the ones you used to have. And it's not just me, but it's the American public as a whole. We used to have, in 2007, 1.9 vehicles per household. We now have 1.7. Part of it is not because of the growth and the demographics underlying the country, but rather the aging of the structure of the population, the movement of the baby boom generation to a less intensive driving set of years. And accompanying that, partly for economic reasons, is a massive change in the behavior of 20 to 35-year-olds who have become significantly more urban than they were a generation ago. And that combination has resulted in this reduction in the vehicles per household, actually in a change in the vehicle fleet. Let's take last year when there were 15 million cars that went into scrap and 12.5 million bought. And you can imagine what that did to accelerate fuel efficiency in the US, having 20 miles to the gallon or lower passenger vehicles replaced by 30 mile to the gallon or higher vehicles. So we're having an acceleration on both of these. Time is up for me, but I have a couple of observations I want to make in terms of some of the dramatic implications of what we're seeing. And one of them really is about gas. We know and we've heard about increases in gas. I talked about the vehicle fleet and what it might mean in terms just of truck driving using more natural gas and less in the way of diesel. We clearly have changes in the use of natural gas as a bridge to the future, as coal plants are retiring on an accelerated basis due to regulation and their substitution only in effect with natural gas. We have increased demand in the residential and commercial space, but there are three areas of unconventional, unexpected demand, one being in natural gas vehicles, another being in LNG, which we've talked about. But the fact is that the US and Canada have the lowest priced gas in the world, other than maybe Qatar, and will have the lowest priced gas in the world for a long time to come. And we've done our own homework on the possible economic consequences of that. We looked just at direct job creation on a really a modest basis, a conservative basis. We looked, just as Dave did, at the petrochemical sector. We looked as well at the fertilizer sector, which has just begun to have an increase in investment. And we looked at metal fabrication, which is highly energy intensive. And we looked at the virtual circle between low gas prices, drilling requirements, the tubular manufacturing industry, the need to build pipelines to bring water in for hydrofracking, for recirculating that water. And we added all these things up, and we looked at the revolution in the US steel industry, which has the cheapest, most efficient steel industry in the world, and the growth of steel manufacturing in Pennsylvania and Ohio, and in Texas, and potentially in Louisiana. And we've come up with this minimum of 3.6 million jobs directly out of what's happening, not to speak of what happens at McDonald's and the like. We also looked at the GDP, and we see an addition basically of 25 basis points a year, or 2 to 3% increase of a higher GDP by 2020 than otherwise might have been the case. And we looked in detail at one of the two big major US imbalances that the world is concerned about. We didn't look at the fiscal imbalance as it might be impacted by job creation and higher GDP growth, and of course that's not insignificant, but we did look at the current account. And we did it in a relatively sophisticated manner. We took the base number today, which is 3% of GDP is the current account deficit. All of that is in oil imports. They would be eradicated by 2020. We didn't say that the current account deficit would end, but we did project as much as a 2.5% of GDP decline in the current account deficit, which would bring it down to less than 1% of GDP, around 0.5% of GDP. And these are really profound changes that ought to put the government in a very tight partnership with what's going underway in this unbelievable revolution, started in the Deepwater, and prompted by high prices, and moved back to old plays like Alaska, and into the extraordinary things that are happening in shale oil. I want to end on one point on oil shale, and that is that just as the administration has been unbelievably forward-looking in putting in place a remarkably robust system for managing growth in Deepwater, and that's what's happened in the opposite direction on real shale, where we have maybe 3 trillion barrels in place. And the restrictions of the government in this administration has imposed on companies, some large ones like one of them at the podium, and other small ones that have in place the kinds of experiments going again that were underway in the late 1970s and early 1980s to tap into those resources. And it's a shame that those restrictions have been in place. I thought Frank was telling me to shut up. He wasn't. He asked me to put in place one more slide. We talked about North America in this, and in the presentation I skipped talking about Mexico. Clearly, Mexico has 30 or 40 billion estimated barrels of commercial reserves in deep water, impeded by a government and a constitution. This is a map of assessed basins for shale-type plays in Mexico. It's clearly the case that the Eagle Ford extends beyond the Mexican border. If you drew a fence down through the border, you would not end the geology. Mexico appears to be very rich in the same kinds of geological wonders that the US and Canada are rich in, and it may be that it doesn't take a constitutional change rather, to find a way under the current Constitution to, in fact, end the decline in Mexican production and reverse it with investments in this area. So, Frank, thanks for asking me to do that. And thank you very much.
Okay, so I obviously neglected to add that Ed's presentations are always content-rich. But I stand by my entertaining comment because you're able to work sex and drugs in your first 30 seconds. So, maybe that's a new moniker going forward. We're starting to break up in the other rooms. I just want to ask one question, which kind of the obvious question here. We talked about the technology in below ground, but almost all the speakers have talked about the above ground issues, right? Being able to manage the circumstances, local communities, build back the confidence of the public, government regulation, partnerships between government and industry. So the question is, how do we actually realize this potential? What steps do we need to do going forward? And I would ask, starting with Mike, just to quickly get on the line and just give your impressions on what next.
Well, I think the level of engagement that I saw as companies were interested in having deepwater drilling resume was very encouraging. It was, for the most part, non-adversarial. It was constructive. And the approach was, let's solve a problem that both industry and the government face about how safely and responsibly to continue exploration in the deep water. So I was actually pleasantly surprised with the tenor, the tone, and the content of those discussions, and I hope those could be a model for the discussions that will take place in other areas as well.
Thank you. Dave?
Well, of course, I've spent a great deal of time in non-technical discussions with people like Mike and his successors. I think in working with regulatory form, I think it starts with both parties and all parties listening to each other and understanding what the real issues are. And I mean really understanding what the issues are. That involves building a level of competence and expertise on both sides, both on the company's side from the regulators and on the regulators understanding the technology that's involved. I think it's very important that regulations are consistent, that they're fair, that they're fairly enforced, that they're stable, that you can know what to expect through time. In that environment, the bar can be very high, but you can work in that environment, and you can plan and invest in that environment. And finally, I think that regulations and regulatory agencies need to work along with industry in an integrated fashion, such that one arm knows what the other arm is doing, because we've seen that that can be very effective. And that can lead, again, to a more consistent approach and really speed up the regulatory process, which I think is essential.
Excellent. Dan?
I start from two premises. Number one, as Dave made in his opening remarks quite clear, an accident anywhere is an accident everywhere, whether it's Macondo or any of the other, I won't mention them because everyone will get upset, accidents. But so it will destroy potentially the credibility if some bad actors don't get the message and live up to it. And secondly, you only get one chance to make a first impression. So we are now doing quite well, incredibly well in this country, but we look around the world, and I've been to many of these countries, and they are stymied in developing their own resources because they have not heeded sufficiently these lessons. So it's the very same kind of mechanisms my colleagues were talking about. You need the transparency, you need the mechanisms, and some of these reports have been talking, such as the CEAB report was talking about the stronger mechanism, the NPC report was talking about centers of excellence, and it's got to be global, and it's got to be done in real time, and it's got to include public groups, industry, and government.
Got it. Ed?
Very briefly, I think there's a requirement to think forward because of events that are unfolding as rapidly as they are, and there are policy issues that are on the horizon that really have to be dealt with. We have, for example, a simple one, an SPR system in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico with two different kinds of oil in it. We will, in the next 2 years, stop importing light sweet crude into the United States. What are we going to do with all this light sweet crude? How should it be deployed? This is not something for 10 years from now. It's something that has to be thought of now. We're going to have, if not total energy independence, we're going to have a surplus of crude oil in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico. What are we going to do with it? Are we going to require Jones Act ships to take this material to the two coasts? Or are we going to have a more rational way of dealing with it. The time to working on that is now, and that's just the tip of these future problems.
So many topics for future discussion. If you all join me in thanking our panel, this has been terrific. Thank you.